Chapter 13. So we're moved away from the brain, going inferior to the brain, moving on to the spinal cord region, as well as the spinal nerves that extend off that region, as well as the reflexes that work with the nerves and the spinal cord in order to do different jobs. So your spinal cord is cylinder shaped, extending from your brainstem all the way down through most of your vertebrae, so the upper 2/3 of your vertebral canal. The inferior margin, so basically the end of it, ends at about L1, so our first lumbar vertebrae, and then it diverges, so it branches out into a structure called the cauda equina. It's given that name because it looks like a horse's tail, so it has a bunch of branching off of that spinal cord, so kind of like a horse's tail, like that ponytail kind of look. With your spinal cord, there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves that extend off our spinal cord. So we have our 12 for our brainstem, 31 for our spinal cord. With the nerves that extend off of the spinal cord, the part of the spinal cord that serves that particular nerve is called a segment. So cutting through our middle of our spinal cord, so opening it up on the inside. So similar to how we have the right and left hemispheres of the brain, we have right and left halves of our spinal cord. So in the anterior region, so this little part here, we have our anterior median fissure. In the back, we have our posterior median sulcus. Okay, so they run the entire length of our spinal cord. This area here, the gray commissure, there's this connecting region between the two sides. Not that they have to communicate with each other, but you might have to have some spinal cords crossing over in certain regions of your spinal cord, and so they'll do so there. So similar to your vertebral regions, your spinal cord also has regions. It has its cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral region. So still having that same order, like your cervical vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae, lumbar vertebrae, and then sacrum at the bottom. So still same type of naming. In your spinal cord, not all of it is one same size shape of the column or tube structure of the spinal cord. There's two areas that are larger than the other, and that's your cervical enlargement and your lumbar enlargement. So the reason why they're larger is because of the extra nerves in those regions in order to supply your arm or to move for your pelvic and lower limbs. So extra nerves in those regions need more space, so that part of the spinal cord is a little bit larger. At the tip of your spinal cord, you have your medullary cone. So this is where the spinal cord tapers. At the end, so this is inferior to your lumbar enlargement. And then after that, your spinal cord, so here we have our medullary cone, will diverge. So branching off a bunch of strands, kind of like hair, into the cauda equina. So earlier, like I talked about the horse tail, same thing. So equina gets the horse part of that name. So those are just nerve roots that will occupy your lower part of your vertebral canal, going into our sacrum and then going through those holes in the sacrum. So that's what those holes are for in that bone. Just like in your brain, your spinal cord has the meninges, so it continues on wrapping around the brain, down the brainstem, and down your spinal cord. So it still has those three layers, which are your dura mater on the outside, the arachnoid mater on the inside, and the pia mater on the more internal surface. Similar to how the layers are arranged in the brain, you have your dura mater on the outside, and then your arachnoid mater, and then your subarachnoid space filled with cerebral spinal fluid. This is also the area where they target if you're getting a lumbar puncture or a spinal tap tap in order to take a sample of your cerebral spinal fluid. And then lastly, your pia mater, closely associated with your spinal cord, except for in the spinal cord, it continues on to form the coccygeal ligament. So ligament connecting bone to bone, so connecting your coccyx to your sacrum. Just like in your brain, your spinal cord has white and gray matter, except for it's reversed in the relationship. So our gray matter is on the inside, kind of shaped like a H or a butterfly, depending on which segment of the spinal cord you're in. And then your white matter is in 3 columns on your on the outside surfaces of your spinal cord. So we have our neuronal bodies here. That's where the synapses are. And then those myelinated axons exiting out into the white matter, and then exiting out as part of some kind of nerve. For the organization of your gray matter, you have your posterior horns, also called your dorsal horns, and your anterior horns, which are also your ventral horns. So the ones in the front are for your motor fibers exiting out your spinal cord. Your ones for your posterior horn will enter into the spinal cord, so that's your sensory information. So posterior or backside of your spinal cord is where the sensory information comes in. So even if this spinal nerve is a mixed nerve, it still splits off, sensory going into the back, motor coming out from the front, and then joining that nerve. So kind of way of thinking of which one is sensory and which one is motor. Kind of think sensory like someone rubbing your back, which is kind of nice. That's kind of like sensation. So your sensory is in the back. Motor is like going forward, doing some kind of action, some kind of command. So that one comes out of the front. Okay, so I'm going to go over a little bit of vocabulary just for our spinal tracts. For the spinal cord, again, you have sensory information going up to the brain. That's your ascending tracts. Motor information coming down from the brain is your descending tracts, where your tracts cross over to the opposite side of the body or contralateral side. So, for example, motor part of the brain command is sent from the left side of the brain. It's going to cross over or decussate to the other side of the spinal cord so that it can control the right side of the body. So left controlling right, right controlling left. Same thing with sensory information. Your left side of the body is sent to your right side of the brain. Your right side of the body is sent to the left side of the brain. So this is contralateral, either control or receiving information from the contralateral side or their opposite side. Ipsilateral is on the same side. So information from that will not cross over to the other side. So there is some information that it will stay on the same side of the body. For our ascending tracts, they're going to send sensory signals up to the brain. So up through the spinal cord and eventually into the brain. So there's 3 neurons that are part of this ascending tract. So we have our first order neuron, which is this one here. So that's our sensory neuron that's going to receive the stimulus and send that information to the spinal cord. Our second order neuron is, so second one in the pathway, will send the information from the spinal cord to the thalamus. And then our third order neuron will take it from the thalamus to the specific location in the cortex where that sensory information is going to later be sent to an association area to be processed. So going to the primary sensory cortex, and then that cortex will send it to the association cortex. For our descending tract, so this is motor commands going from the brain traveling down our spinal cord. There are 2 neurons involved with it. So we have our upper motor neuron sending it from the cortex to the brain stem, and then it will synapse with a lower motor neuron that takes it from the brain stem or spinal cord and then to our particular target. So our target, of course, in this case is a muscle. Moving on to the nerves that either send information to the spinal cord or send information or like a motor command away from the spinal cord. So the nerves that send information to the spinal cord, so these are our sensory afferent nerves, carries that information from the sensory receptors. So for example, in the dermatome on skin, so this is a particular area of skin that is served by a specific neuron or a specific nerve. That information is sent on sensory afferent fibers, so going up an ascending track eventually. The motor nerves extending away from the spinal cord, sending information to the muscles. Okay, so from our spinal cord to our nerves, so thinking still same thing, E exit for efferent. Some nerves have both afferent and efferent fibers, so just like a highway that has a northbound and southbound lane, there's still information going in both directions, but they're kept separate, so it's not like you're having a mix-up of information on the same pathway. Both your sensory and motor fibers can also be described as somatic or visceral. So somatic going to the external surfaces, so like your joints, your bones, skeletal muscles, as well as skin, or visceral, talking about your internal organs. So they could be either motor or sensory in that case as well. Another different type of descriptors, general. So again, these are more somatic type of sensory information, or special, and that really goes for more so, like for example, your special senses. For each spinal nerve, it starts off from the spinal cord as your proximal branches, also called your spinal nerve roots. So there's two roots. You have your posterior dorsal root, so again in the back. That's where you receive sensory input into your spinal cord. For your posterior root, there also can be, on the picture, there you go, these posterior root ganglion, where there's synapses that occur here in this bulge of neurosomas and having a lot of also synaptic connections, and then that nerve will take it into the root. So it doesn't have to take it directly into the spinal cord. It could synapse right at this dorsal root before that neuron then takes it to the spinal cord. For the anterior side, so get front action motor command side, you have your ventral roots. There's no ganglion there, so your input is just sent away from the spinal cord on your lower motor neuron out to the afferent fiber for the spinal nerve. Last branching off of your spinal cord is your cauda equina. So these, again, more nerves going from L2, so our second lumbar vertebrae, all the way down to your first bone in your coccyx region. So extending that entire length are those branching off of nerves from there. For some of your nerves, they don't just extend out of your spinal cord and go in one path to a particular target. Sometimes these nerves will form webs and branch up with other nerves. Basically, this keeps everything together. So if they're kind of knitted together in a web of nerves, then as those tubes of nerves or those strands of nerves, as they're going to the particular target, helps to keep them from being tangled up. So there are 5 nerve plexuses, so that's the web of nerves that I was talking about. So they'll branch off, but then they'll form webbings with each other, and that helps to keep them not only organized, but also keeps them from tangling up. So these 5 nerve plexuses, we have our cervical plexus, is found in the neck. It supplies the neck region, and a particular nerve in this plexus is the phrenic nerve that serves the diaphragm. Next one, the brachial plexus. So same thing, kind of like arm, it's near the shoulder. So upper limb, some of the shoulder and neck region. One nerve for it that's special is the median nerve, which when it is damaged or pinched can cause carpal tunnel syndrome. So when people are, spend their whole life typing on a keyboard and it causes stress in their wrist, so it's a very painful situation. Lumbar plexus, so even lower on our spinal cord, goes to the abdominal wall, the anterior or front part of our thigh and genitalia region. Even lower, sacral plexus, so going towards our pelvis, so the rest of our lower trunk as well as lower limb region. And then your coccygeal plexus extending off of that, and in some cases will branch up with the sacral plexus. Some of these nerve plexuses also have what's called a somatosensory function. So incorporating information from where your bones are, your joints, your muscle, and skin, and this is called proprioception. So it tells your brain where your body is. Where is it in space, as well as what movements are occurring in the body. So helping your brain to incorporate that information. So for example, needing to know, okay, our legs just tilted because we're on a boat. So if we're on a boat tilts, then that information is sent to the brain. Then your brain's able to make an appropriate response on how to keep you balanced even though the boat is tilted. So telling which nerves to, okay, you guys contract up so that this person can stay on the boat and stay balanced versus falling off. For those that just have a motor function, again, muscle contractions send that motor command to that area. So here's an example of a plexus, this one specifically being the cervical plexus. So we have our branching off of our spinal nerves, off of our spinal cord, and then these nerves, as they branch off, they'll also rejoin each other, forms bridges with each other, and therefore helping to just keep things from getting tangled. And again, the special nerve in this plexus is the phrenic nerve. So this nerve will move down into the chest and supply the diaphragm. So there's the nerve. Eventually it's going to continue down, supplying the diaphragm, telling the diaphragm to contract, and allows you to breathe. So it's going to change the pressures inside of your lungs, which will control whether or not air is going to flow into or out the lung. So still going down its pressure gradient. So similar to stuff we've already covered. It's just a new application for it. But again, that's next semester. Another function of your spinal cord is to be involved with a reflex. So sometimes when you get sensory information into your body, it doesn't have to travel all the way up to your brain in order for your brain to tell your muscles how to move in a situation. Sometimes the information is sent just to the spinal cord, and then the appropriate response is sent right back out from the spinal cord, and it causes a very quick response. This response is called your reflexes. So there's a generic pattern for a somatic reflex arc. So our somatic receptors are the one that's going to receive the stimulation. So these are found in your skin, muscles, and tendons. So these receptors will send that information along afferent nerve fibers to your spinal cord or brainstem if it's up in the head and neck region. In the head and neck region, or in your spinal cord, so brainstem or spinal cord, those are your integrating centers. So these are going to take that sensory information and decide on the appropriate action. So with these areas, the pathway from our afferent nerve fibers to our efferent nerve fibers, so this is going to send the command to the muscles for the appropriate response. That appropriate response is mapped out either through interneurons or direct connections between the afferent fibers and the efferent fibers in order to cause a response. So the response is done by the effectors. So the efferent nerve fibers send that command to the muscles. Those muscles will then be the effectors to carry out a response. So for example, if I touch my finger to something sharp, then the reflex of me moving my hand away is very quick. So we have our sensory information taking that the pain signal up through my arm into the spinal cord, and then median the spinal cord, you have the afferent nerve fibers either synapsing onto your interneurons that are found only in your central nervous system, or synapsing directly onto an efferent nerve fiber. That efferent nerve fiber is then stimulated to tell the muscles in my hand, arm region, wherever, to move away from the sharp object, and therefore that muscles will carry out the response. So those are your effectors. So here's an example of this. So if you've ever gone to a doctor and they hit your knee with the little triangular shaped hammer here. So what they're doing is they're putting pressure on this quadriceps tendon. So as it pulls on that receptor, pulls on that tendon, so it causes that pressure. The receptors then send that sensory information down the nerve fiber that is sent into our spinal cord, where it directly synapses onto a efferent nerve fiber, which sends out that motor command, causing this quadriceps muscle to contract, therefore pulling the knee away from that pressure. So that is what causes that kick, is just to move quick reflex in order to move away from that painful stimuli. So part of how this works is inside your muscles, you have some of your muscle fibers that do not do the work of contracting or causing a physical force onto another object. So for example, skeletal muscles pulling on bones. So inside your muscles, you also have these muscle spindles. The muscle spindles are stretch receptors that help to tell your brain how long your muscles are and where they're moving. So again, part of proprioception that help to monitor where your body is in space and how it's moving. So telling your brain all this information in order to, for example, coordinated movement. So everything working together in order to perform a specific action, any kind of corrective reflex. So not only keeping your balance, but also moving away from painful stimuli, helping to keep your muscle tone correct so that you're maintaining, for example, posture, or if you're doing some kind of movement, making sure your certain muscles are able to be contracted enough to help, for example, like your core muscles, keeping them nice and tight so that you have good balance when you're doing something. So just keeping your body upright and protecting your organs and everything from damage. So here's an example of a muscle spindle. So on the outside, we have our contracting muscle cells. Here's the muscle spindles that has those fibers where the nerve endings wrap around their fibers, telling the brain how the muscle is moving as well as the length and position of that muscle. All right, that's it for Chapter 13. So this is the end of our Module 4 material.